My name is David Schnese Jacobson. I'm the preaching professor here at Boston University School of Theology. I'm pleased to welcome you to another one of our webinars, this time with Dr. James Nieman, who is president of the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. Really happy to have him here. He is the author of some very important works both in homiletics and practical theology. Today we're going to be considering two in particular. His 2001 book co-authored with Tom Rogers called Preaching to Every Pew, and another book that he published in 2008 called Knowing the Context. I'm very pleased to welcome you, Dr. Nieman, to our conversation today and to this webinar, and I just want to say thank you for joining us.
Thanks. I can see from other folks there's the sound is pretty much, from you, David, was pretty poor. You were in and out, and there were certain parts of what you said that I didn't quite catch.
Okay.
Just in the broad frame I did, though. Is my sound consistent to you?
Yes.
Yes. We're hearing you very well. What I'd like to do is to invite the participants to introduce themselves and then ask you to give your presentation as a way of launching our conversation.
Great, that's fine.
Great. Okay, so I have three students joining with me today, and we're working together this term on matters related to preaching and context, hence the invitation to you. So I'll start over here on my left with Mason Lee, and I'll ask each student to talk about who they are, the program they're in, and their interest in the topic around preaching and context. Mason.
Hello, my name is Mason Lee, and I'm a Master of Sacred Theology student here at Boston University, focusing in homiletics. And I'm interested particularly in the way that theologies of preaching intersect with the realities of context of preaching, and how that dynamic works itself out.
Hello, Dr. Nieman. My name is Dusen Lee, second year PhD program in practical theology and homiletics. My interest is in the preaching as a tool to nourish interpretive community of faith.
I didn't hear that at all.
Could you project it louder, please?
I'm sorry, is there a microphone that could be nearer to you all at that end of the table?
What we might try to do is to move nearer to the mic itself, okay?
Yeah. I'm sorry about this, but it's going to be really hard for us to have a conversation with this sound quality.
Okay, sure.
Now, that's something. Now, I see the problem, of course, is that...
Did you sit? Would you mind going down here?
That's right.
We're working on it.
Sorry about that, but it's really tough to get you all on screen.
We're getting there.
Those of you on the sides need to squeeze in a bit closer. Get cozy with your professor.
Okay, the camera person will be back in a second. She'll probably draw a wider shot.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Please do say, go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Dusen Lee, second year PhD program in homiletics and practical theology. My interest is interpretive community of faith, how to nourish interpretive community of faith through preaching.
Okay.
And my name is Darren Stylianopoulos. I'm a third year MDiv student. I'm also the pastor of congregational care at my church in Boston, which happens to be a multicultural congregation. So I'm interested in, I'm not a part of this directed study, but just stepped in to hopefully gain some insight into some helpful ways to preach to such a congregation.
Okay. Well, if that's where you're serving, you should be doing this. You should be doing this webinar, not me. So.
James, one last thing. We have one other student who's present through the webinar connection. Her name is Elizabeth Siwo Okundi. She's working on a dissertation on African preaching. She's very interested in looking at the small voices of African preaching, trying to look at how preachers in Africa themselves describe their own understanding of preaching in their own voices, doing some important qualitative research to complement what's often been a rather skewed Western way of looking at the African context of preaching. And she was very excited to be a part of the webinar today and has a very strong interest in context as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, and I'll have our tech person working on any residual sound problems in the background. But we can hear you very well, so please go ahead and start us off. Okay. Oh, James, I just discovered one thing. Our tech person said if you had a pair of headphones, it might help. Do you have anything like that? No. What, do you have a plan B?
Sorry.
Okay. Well, why don't you go ahead, James, and she'll keep working on it.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm grateful to you, David, for inviting me to be a part of this, and thankful for your mutual interest in my work. This doesn't happen very often, I can tell you. And I'm also appreciative of the kind of work that each of you are doing. All these projects sound very interesting and diverse in their own particular ways. I'm not sure if these remarks are going to be exactly what you were hoping, David, but I hope that they're useful and generate a rich conversation about matters of context and theology and proclamation. I view these two books as sort of, they are sort of my provisional statement about how those things relate to each other, and so I'll be keying a lot off of the content of the books in some respects. These come from two very different scholarly periods for me. I was in different institutions when they were written, and while there are certain continuities between them, there are really some important distinctives about them. But among the common pieces that I just want to give as background is that they were both intended and structured as teaching resources, including self-teaching resources, that we wanted to put them in the hands of people so that they could learn. So these are not trying to make a high-level set of scholarly claims in homiletical literature. It was really trying to be a useful tool for actual practitioners and those learning to do that. And they both obviously deploy qualitative methods and framing structures. They're overtly attentive to theological questions in preaching. And one thing that sort of surprised me in rereading them was how much they are open-ended, at least in my estimation, that the last chapters in each of them are really a gesture toward the reader and toward the field about what might be next topics to pursue. But I also want to point out, and this is really what I want to key off of in talking about context, theology, and proclamation, I want to key off of four aspects with each of the two books that might be helpful to see the distinctions between them. So I hope this is what you were looking for, David. I want to talk first, strangely enough, about the origins of the books. It tells you something about how they were aimed differently. The origins of the book, what I view as the real final focus of the book, the theology of the book, the theological claims, explicit and implicit, and some of the shortcomings that I see in each of the books. So my reflections on the books are really my reflections on theology, context, and proclamation. And with that, I'm sure that we can move into a more interesting conversation where you are doubtless the experts much more than I. Because I'm a president and I've given up all scholarship. I have no idea what's happening in the field right now. So let's turn first to Preaching to Every Pew, 2001. This book, its origins, began as a conversation with a colleague, with Tom Rogers, and I can literally remember the cocktail party we were at where we cooked up this book. And it was basically a lament. We were both lamenting that at that point, this is the late 1990s, there was nothing that helped us address this kind of resource that we wanted in teaching. We were constantly getting the question about how do you preach in culturally rich and diverse circumstances, and how can you be more attentive to your preaching being available in culturally diverse ways. So we were eager to explore that topic for ourselves as we were planning, but at the same time we saw some pretty obvious limitations to our own abilities, not least of which is that we were a couple of white middle-aged guys with very limited perspectives and experiences in the area. Both Tom and I had preached and served in quite multiculturally diverse places, but that said, we didn't view ourselves as particular experts in this area. So the breakthrough in this book's origins was to realize that there were lots of practitioners out there who did have wisdom in this area from which we could draw, and that they would be the book's voice. Provided we didn't try to colonize their thinking or cram it into a certain framework, if we really listened to them, they would be the voice of the book. And our job was to assemble that. So we thought also that by opening up a reasonable, respectable interview method, we could invite the readers of the book to think about how they might conduct such study on their own, where they were located. So it's a two-level book. One is, what did our informants have to tell us? And then by showing our research, the reader would also learn, oh, I could do this myself in some sort of scaled-down fashion. All of that is to say that at its origins, we really had no certain conclusions in advance of writing the book. I can't say that clearly enough. What we had were 88 non-coded, complete transcripts of interviews. And I mean, I'm talking about a pile of papers that was this high, and we didn't have any sort of coding. This is all hand-coded. So it was a research mess. We had a few hunches, that's to be sure, but it was mostly inductive discovery from our fieldwork that guided what we did in the book. So that's the origins of the book. The focus of the book is this. As we moved into trying to make a case statement about the book with a publisher and for ourselves, we realized what we were really talking about was rapid, unavoidable, irreversible social multiculturality. We didn't frame this as a book about context. We framed this as a book about the many ways in which cultures were intersecting, crossing over, influencing each other. And that was lending a particular urgency to what preachers needed to engage every week, or else they'd fall short. So that was the premise of the book. And so we wanted to say, given that reality that's expanding and only going to continue, what are the practices we can learn that could help us reach many different kinds of people at one time, or at least more types of people than just ourselves? That's the premise of the book. Due to the immensity and the complexity of the issue, though, there's lots of ways we could have cut this. We used a cultural frames approach to identify certain insights about particular cultural groups and strategies about preaching. So you see in the structure of chapters 2 through 5, the same pattern appears. What did our informants tell us about the groups? What did our informants tell us about their preaching in relationship to that framing? Beneath all of this, though, was a pedagogy of cross-cultural change. And the pedagogy I'm talking about is this, that when we engage cross-culturally, it's not about, finally, the real learning is not about how do I learn about this other person's group so that I can understand them better, or master them, which is often what we try to do in our own bigotry. But instead, understanding another group causes you to rethink yourself.
Right.
That it's transformative of the self, and that's what preachers needed to do about themselves and their preaching through the encounter with other people. And that's the trajectory that you see in chapter 6. So that's sort of the focus and overview of the book. What about the theology? Well, at heart, the little nub of theology at the beginning was simply put the lawyer's question to Jesus in Luke 10:29. Who is my neighbor? And we really took that seriously about what did that mean to talk about neighbor. And that gave us a theological motivation. Who is shown to be our neighbor multiculturally, and what does this ask of us as preachers? Embedded in the neighbor question as a theological starting point was a threefold sense of theological recognition. And I'm just repeating stuff that you perhaps looked at in chapter 1. That recognition, recognizare, means not just to notice somebody else, not just to honor and appreciate them, but to rethink yourself because of the encounter with that person. So you hear the cross-cultural pedagogy coming through in the theology. Another theological point I'd make about this book is that perhaps naively, we withheld theological judgment about those that we interviewed. In other words, we took their good practices as preachers to be theologically virtuous and commendable. We didn't say, in listening to somebody in an interview, we didn't think, wow, that's a really questionable strategy, or, I disagree with the theology that you've got in that thought. We tried to be agnostic about the person's overt theology and say what they were doing was commendable and therefore virtuous, and we should listen to it. And what's often beneath all of that is a theology of inclusivity and openness. That was the presumed good. Now, I still hold that. I think I agree with the theology of inclusivity and openness, but I think there are shortcomings to that view too, or at least you want to have a sort of critical edge in this that we might be able to note in just a moment. So I hope that second point is sort of clear, that theologically we're not trying to make a judgment about the other person's theology, but sort of presuming a good about theological inclusivity. Finally, I think the book's methodology itself was its own theological claim. The methodology of the book was to learn inductively from fieldwork, to pay attention to actual local practices and listen to those and learn from those. That it's a way of respecting local practical wisdom. I think that's a theological claim. To draw that into contrast, it's quite different from saying, I have all the answers theologically and you need to be the empty vessel that receives them. But instead, to put the weight on the wisdom that was available locally and worth listening to. So you see that in chapter 6 and at earlier points. There emerges what you might consider in this book a modest new attempt at an inductively derived homiletical theology. Let me turn then finally to shortcomings with this book. And there are so many. Unsurprisingly, the limits of the book form meant that we could only choose 4 frames on which we'd be able to explore. And there were many other worthy candidates that were omitted. If there's a single critique that I've heard more often than any other, it's, why didn't you deal with the frame of gender, of sexual orientation, of ableness, of age? And I agree. Tom and I knew all this. We were well aware, and actually it percolated up in so many of the interviews as well. But we could only do so much. That's why we hoped to give people the tools to do their own research. And we actually hoped also that this might be a catalytic book for other scholars, that they would fill in with their own exploration frames that we had missed. In truth, that never happened, but that's the way it goes. It's happened in some ways with certain particular scholars, but this did not exactly generate a groundswell of positive response in terms of people wanting to try the same thing. I suppose that stack of papers would be one reason for that. It's a lot of work to do research this way. Second shortcoming, after further thought about this book, I suspect that we did not sufficiently appreciate how some success in multicultural preaching, maybe much success in multicultural preaching, is due to situational opportunities. In other words, you can learn a lot from somebody else about what worked for them, but if you're in a place that is fairly monocultural, or if you lack the kind of savvy and personal skills that some of our interviewees had, if the cards are stacked against you situationally, you're not going to be able to push that glacier very far. And I think we needed to be more honest about the way that contextual and personal resources were not available to everybody as they tried to do this. Finally, I worried in the subsequent years that the efforts to understand groups and cultural groups and contexts, no matter how respectfully, how thoroughly, will be used for bad ends. People, we would hope that people would be doing this to respect and appreciate people in their own terms. But I know that a lot of the reason why people want to learn about others is so they can pigeonhole them, or so they can manipulate them or market to them. So there's an underlying anxiety in this book that I think you hear, and it really comes up in the 2008 book, the anxiety about manipulating others with this sort of information rather than appreciating them. So, we still on track?
Yep.
Okay so far?
Yep.
Okay. I'm well reputed as a lecturer that I have the same lecture style as one would expect from drinking a nice cool drink of water from a high pressure fire hose. So I know there's a lot of data coming out here. So, but I want to be respectful so we have time left, especially with our slow start. Let me turn then to the second book, Knowing the Context, 2008. The origins of this book were quite different. It began not in a conversation, but with an invitation. Frankly, an invitation from the publisher and from the editor to write one volume for an 8-volume series on the fundamentals of preaching. The idea was that, as David knows, hardly anybody buys any sort of a single book on preaching. There's multiple books that you use even in an intro course, or articles, or any number of things. The publisher was trying to recognize that and set up a kind of an 8-volume series where people could pick and choose what they wanted, or learners could pick and choose what they had not learned in seminary but wanted to home in on a little bit more. So mine was the section on context. In fact, I had done a lot of teaching and writing on this. Most of my work is actually in congregational studies and denominational studies. So I'd done a lot of research on this. I think the publisher wanted something really simple. They wanted a simple book about how do you make preaching more relevant, you know, that kind of tired old chestnut. How do you make it better understood and appreciated? There's absolutely going to be nothing controversial about preaching. You should never have to work as a listener. It should just be easy and relevant. Which is all another way of saying that I think the publisher was far more interested in marketing the series than asking what I might actually want to say. Believe me, this is true because they spent enormous amounts of time on having a consistent look and feel across the series, you know, with the titles and the graphic. If you've ever seen these all together, it makes a big artwork. Kind of ridiculous, but that's how they were. They really didn't care that much what I was going to say. We had the same experience with the publisher, by the way, with the first book, which I always refer to as the furniture book. Because preaching to every pew was not our choice.
Oh.
Publishers often supply, and preaching to pews? No, I don't think so. But I mean, I understand it's a metonym, but really. Anyway, I took the bait and thought that this would just be a very simple volume about how ethnographic field work, and it would be valuable to preachers, how to conduct responsible research. But as you know from looking at the book, that's really only the content of, whoops, we got reversed there. I'm not sure why, but I need to flip it around.
Do you?
Okay.
Okay. Because people.
Yeah, what?
We were adjusting it on our end. That's okay.
Okay. I didn't
okay.
effect. Sorry. Never mind.
That's all right. What do we need?
Andrew, would you pull the camera back to get a little
As you know, that focus on ethnographic tools is really chapter 3, part of chapter 3. It's 17 pages in the middle of the book. So what I thought this was going to be about really dramatically changed. And I just want to say a little bit more about this. The book first expanded outward in 2 directions. First, to a more robust sense of methods. That's the discussion about frames, not surprising if you read the first book. And then science, sort of the interpretation of what you learn. So there's a more robust methodology that makes up the middle 3 chapters. But then the book expanded still further outward to chapter 5 about trying to explore an example and its implications for preaching. And that example percolated backward through the middle 3 chapters. So if you can believe this, it was written really in a haphazard way. Chapter 5 percolated back into chapters 2 through 4. And then last is what you read first, which is chapter 1 about why context matters. So that's the origins of the book. As to the focus, I could be a lot briefer. As I said, I was seeking to write a teaching book. And really a self-teaching book that showed how to do a method of looking at context. I was imagining as much its use by ordinary practitioners serving in congregations as I did people sitting in a classroom at a seminary. I'm pretty sure it's a lot more ambitious than what the publisher wanted. On the other hand, the publisher doesn't have a real room to gripe because the book's been translated into Chinese, and so I'm really praying for the royalties on that one. I don't know how big the Cantonese market is, but beyond this, it's a much more of a theological reflection piece, overtly theological reflection piece than the first book was, about the place of context in preaching and homiletics as a discipline. It's important to remember, too, that in terms of focus, once again, this book was one book in a series. It was never intended to be a standalone book on preaching, even as it fills a basic intent within a larger series as an introductory treatment. I turn to the third topic, theology, with this book. In its final form, this book has an overt set of theological claims right at the beginning about how context and preaching relate to each other, one that you might disagree with or debate or complexify, and I think that's wonderful. To me, context matters to preaching affirmatively because the context is where we meet God's promise, and negatively because that's where we meet falsehood that needs to be confronted through preaching. That's very simplified. Preaching matters to context because preaching utilizes four cultural, contextual features that we find every day. The use of time, space, people, culture. And so to preach is to be deeply contextually engaged. I frankly had not read a very good account of how these two would relate to each other. We assume they always do,
right,
but I wanted to think it through for myself. So that was one piece of it. The other way I tried to think it through was a somewhat brief discussion at the end of chapter 1 about our ancestors in preaching from antiquity, from the Middle Ages, from the 20th century, about their theological purpose in trying to preach contextually. That they weren't about trying to manipulate or to market when they preached. Their concerns were about reaching the lost, healing the wounded, teaching the ignorant, freeing the imprisoned. These are theological claims that were present in ancient preachers and medieval and modern preachers, and I wanted to sort of share a bit of that. And I took up the same theme again in chapter 4 about the theological depth of the signs that we preach through. Last word, and then I'll be quiet. Shortcomings. I've already noted that the book is not a standalone book, and so the book has sometimes been critiqued for not being a thorough homiletic, covering all kinds of other topics. Why didn't you deal more with Scripture? Why didn't you deal more with delivery? Because there's other volumes that were dealing with that. I wasn't asked to do that. And I think there's plenty of actually implicit stuff about that in the book if you read it carefully. I do worry, though, that even if you properly situate this book within the series, it's a demanding read to internalize what I was trying to get at. It requires a lot of patient effort and reflective engagement that are not widely rewarded in congregations. And I think that's a possible shortcoming of the book. A second shortcoming it may sound paradoxical, but I fear the book didn't go, if on the one hand it went too far in giving too much method, it maybe didn't go far enough in exploring what we mean by the theological situation. And here I actually mean the German word Situation, as Karl Jaspers used the term. To engage the full human situation is an existential thing, not just a sociological thing, right? So there's a way in which this book deals with the ephemera of daily life and culture and local context. But really, finally, what is our situation as human beings with one another? We face limit conditions. We struggle with failure, with joy, with death, with things that are delightful and sorrowful. And these things are extraordinarily hard to get to know. In the end, we maybe know them about ourselves. And I don't think this maybe seems like a really spacey thing in talking about context, but the real full human context is often hidden from view. How do we talk about that in preaching? That's a really profound kind of question that really struck me, probably 2 years after the book was done. And therefore, there's not a lot of discussion in the book about the risk that's necessary to open up oneself to deal with the depth of the real human situation. There's a kind of contextual preaching that involves personally disclosing yourself and taking a pastoral risk towards others. And that doesn't show up very much in the book. It's much more about the social and public context that we engage in preaching. So I don't know if that last point made any sense, but to me it's been worrisome because I view preaching not as an exercise of religious communication, but of religious encounter. And that may not have gone far enough to say how much I see that woven together. Well, as the nicest narcissist I ever knew once said, enough about me, now you talk about me. That's a joke. But I'd be very interested to hear what kinds of questions, concerns, disagreements, pushback. It's all on the table.
At this point, I just want to add one little layer to the conversation because I think it gives us a little more context about our meeting today as well. One thing that unites what a lot of us are doing in reading your work is the fact that we're viewing it within the overall practical theological task of preaching. So you've acknowledged that these books were written with the practitioner in mind, but one other reason we're interested in dialoguing with you is we're interested in thinking about how things like reflecting on context and the use of ethnography as a tool might also affect the way we think about the practical theological task of preaching generally. So we may come back to that in a second, but I first want to give Darren an opportunity for a right of first refusal on a question, because she may have to leave early. So Darren, do you have a question?
Just practically speaking, how or when would you anticipate a pastor engaging in this kind of ethnographic project?
I think the first part of the question again. I'm not sure I heard you.
Sure. Hold on one second. Okay. Can I try now? Okay. So the question was just, practically speaking, when would you expect that a pastor would engage in this sort of a ethnographic project? So, and I'm thinking more in terms of their longevity in a particular congregation. So I think that a lot of, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, that the success of or effectiveness of a pastor preaching in a multicultural context has to do with certain, maybe their relationships within that setting, with their personality or their gifts, and it takes a while for those to get going as a new pastor in a church. And so
that's a great question. It's a set of questions actually, and you can tell that I had this anxiety in writing the second book about like when within a human lifetime is any pastor going to be able to do this sort of stuff. But I tried to say that I think that a lot of the ordinary pastoral skills and opportunities that you already have actually are in fact a kind of a research. It doesn't have to be a formalized, I'm having to, in the book I'm having to sort of thematize things and describe as an overall idealized project. But when I think about somebody serving someplace, it's much more about what do you encounter on a daily basis in the daily ways that you meet with people, observe what's happening. And I think pastors are often very good sleuths about this stuff, and they just don't appreciate about themselves that they actually have a lot of sleuthing going on already. I'm just asking you to be mindful about that and take a few notes and take a little extra time to reflect. Weirdly enough, I think the hard part about this method is not about, going, if you're an active pastor and out in the community and stuff, it's not about learning what's out there. It's about taking time in your life to reflect on it and say, what does this mean? So that's part of it. I also heard your question as one about timing, as in when in a pastoral tenure would you do this? Well, there'd be some argument to say it's something you ought to try to do almost from the beginning, because as an older colleague of mine said, you only get a few months where you get to claim that you're fat, dumb, and happy. That you're just new to the situation, and I think you got to take advantage of that and say, hey, I'm just asking some big questions about, that there's a natural time to do that. The preacher in the book who is mentioned didn't do this until, I want to say, 5 years into the ministry that we're talking, the context in which that person served. So it doesn't have to be at the beginning. It can happen later, as you say, when you had a chance to get a few street smarts about who do I need to talk to, and access points, culture brokers who will open doors for you. Am I getting an answer to your question?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay.
I know some of the other students wanted to ask questions about theology and ethnography, so I'll ask Mason and Duce if they have anything they'd like to pose.
Hello, Dr. Nieman. One of the things I was interested in the Preaching to Every Pew volume was the role of the preacher that develops through it. It seemed very collaborative in nature in terms of paying attention, involving others. There was a much more collaborative process there. But on the other hand, there also seems to be a way in which the preacher is not just one of the people, right? I mean, they have these skills, they have these capacities, these virtues that ethnography requires. And so I'm just wondering if you would talk a little bit about theologically in this kind of model, how do you see the preacher functioning?
Yeah, I think about it. I hope this is getting at what you're asking. I understand it as a question about intersecting conversations, mutually intersecting conversations. And the reason that it needs to be collaborative, I'll stick to that side first and then talk about the distinctive role. The reason it needs to be collaborative is that wherever you preach, this conversation of this community, however loosely or tightly constructed it is, this conversation has been going on a lot longer than you've been around, and it's going to continue after you leave. So you need their help to get on board with the conversation and to understand what are the issues and what's the internal languages and the ways they think through stuff. But you're not an innocent bystander. You're not just any other person. And I don't mean that in a hierarchical sense, like somehow you're better or holier or something like that. I mean, this is very much about a theology of call within the context of an ongoing theological conversation in a community. And the theology of call is, you've been called by this assembly to bring a distinctive word. If that's not going on, then you've got no business speaking. You haven't been authorized in a sense. So in light of that call, in light of being invited into that community to bring a particular word, you then have the opportunity to be a catalyst. You bring a larger and deeper and longer theological conversation that maybe is informed by the tradition, by scripture, things like that, into conversation with that existing theological conversation. And so I think it becomes mutual in that respect. But you can't deny the fact that you have a distinctive word to bring. So one of the things you may discover, let's be more specific, one of the things you may discover, people think I'm sort of like naive about evil in congregations. Believe me, that's not true. I've studied way too many of them. So, I mean, you see something, I want to be more appreciative about congregations, but you see stuff that is profoundly unhealthy or dysfunctional. And you need to bring a distinctive word that intersects with that critically, for the sake of their life and of their thriving. You need to call them to something different. But you really can't do that effectively if you're not first understanding the conversation that's going on.
Thank you.
I'm also aware, Jim, that we have two other students who are participating online. One is a PhD student, Sung-Yoon Jung, who's in Nashville, Tennessee. She's writing a dissertation on Psalmic theological preaching for Korean immigrant communities in the U.S. And she had a question, so I'm going to read it from the chat room. She says, I think many biblical figures experienced a sense of displacement, such as Esther and the Israelites, Abraham, Joseph, and she's wondering if you could recommend some books that explore such theological refinement of the displaced on those biblical figures. I assume she's drawing on the frame of displacement from Preaching to Every Pew.
Yeah. I only laugh because it's a terrific question and really nicely tied to that page in the furniture book. But I don't have an answer for you offhand about books that would explore theological refinement of those displaced figures. It's a great question, and I'm embarrassed to say I don't have an answer for you. I wish I had some of my biblical colleagues here who probably pretty quickly could name some things. We didn't in the writing of this book move into that area, but it's a terrific question. I'm just sorry that I don't have an answer for you.
I do know that Paul Minear, M-I-N-E-A-R, has a book on refugees and the study of the Bible, and I wonder if that might at least be a beginning point. But I'll just say
I also think about two other books. Okay, so maybe a couple things come to mind. It's a very hard read, but actually, Ernst Käsemann's Habilitation Schrift was on the book of Hebrews, it was called The Wandering People of God.
Yeah.
And he wrote the book while he was serving in a blue-collar parish in central southern Germany in the midst of the rise of the Nazi Party. And a lot of the people he was serving were people who were pretty enamored with Nazism and felt themselves displaced in their society. And he was trying to use Hebrews as a language of reassurance. It wasn't just his Habilitation Schrift, it was a kind of a pastoral call to his people to do something, to see the world differently, that we're always on a journey with God, is kind of the message of Käsemann's book. But it's still in print. It's a very interesting book. The other one I think about is Ellis's book on 1 Peter. His commentary on 1 Peter. I think it's Ellis, but I'm not sure that's right. And it talks about the 1 Peter community, which is living in Asia Minor as a fairly displaced group of people that is spread out all over Asia Minor. It's about the size of Montana. Maybe one person per 100 or per 1,000 has a sort of Christian connections or Judeo-Christian connection, and he talks about the people of 1 Peter as being displaced. So those would be some other suggestions.
Sure. Mason Lee has another question you'd like to ask.
Dr. Nieman. I'm interested in one of the things you said earlier about a total account of culture is existential, or the human situation is existential, not just sociological. How would you go about that if you were to write part 2 for preaching for the furniture book? How would you go about accounting for that existential quality in a way that doesn't sort of become an appeal to this universal human experience?
Yeah, right. Well, I'm guided here by how Jaspers thought about, he was both a philosopher and psychotherapist. How he thought about how we come to terms with what he called die Grenze, the limitation, the great limitation of life, the boundary experiences of life. Grenze, it means like a frontier or a border or something. And his conclusion was that we really you couldn't universalize your experience. That what you had to do was to own up to what your own experience was, plumb that deeply, and then take the risk to meet another and listen for their experience. So it's quite the opposite of universalizing my experience and saying, well, I can speak for everybody. It's that risk, that very deep risk of saying, this is what I experience. Is that anything like what you experience? Let me hear what you engage. And at that depth level of encounter, as we invite people, one another out into a common space, that you could get to a deeper question of the existential context.
Thank you. We have a question from Elizabeth Siwo Kundi, and it's also in the chat room. She says, Professor Nieman, you mentioned the use of manipulation in research. Could you speak to some other dangers, common and not common, regarding ways of approaching research on preaching and ways to avoid dangers like manipulation?
There's some... When I was thinking about the manipulation problem or the marketing problem in this, it was more at the level of the end user of research, that sometimes pastors can be a little dishonest with themselves about why they want to learn about other people, and it's that's born of it. It actually goes back to your earlier question about often we want to get to know about other people because of our own neediness, the gap we have within ourselves that we need filled by other people liking us. So if I can use my research to appeal to you, to please you, then I'll feel better about myself. Well, that's crummy preaching, that's bad theology, it's bad ministry. That's why I talked about that. But I heard your question about what other dangers. Here now, I want to talk about at the user end, but at the research end. I think the most common dangers that happen are stopping too soon. So you fall in love with the perception that you have of a particular group you're studying, and you stop there. So one of the things that good sociology shows you is triangulating your research. So you're asking from more than one angle of vision, from more than one type of information, is this really happening? Always having a critical question as you're posing your research, and that keeps you from imagining that from just projecting your own thoughts onto a context. I would say that's the most significant one that I would name as a danger in this kind of research. There's probably others if we had more time to talk about them, but I've also seen there's another question on the line that I want to make sure we attend to.
Right, so let's jump to that. This is from Duse Lee, who's sitting here with me, but hopefully in a way to make it more accessible to the other people online, he's typed his question. So he's wanted to know about whether, he says he thinks you're using a semiotic lens with signs and symbols in your books, and I see that especially in knowing the context. Can you apply this approach to revise our understanding of the text? If it is possible, do we need to define the relationship between text and context as a sort of porous and interpenetrating reality? Duse has a bit of a post-structuralist interest in some of these questions.
Yes. Well, first I want to say, David, you're a lucky guy because you have these really super smart grad students asking these excellent questions.
Yeah, they're really good.
Yeah, you totally get it. You totally get the issue there in semiotics, to me, is about this, as you put it, it's a lovely phrase, a sort of porous and interpenetrating reality between text and context. In fact, a lot of that discussion about semiotics you may have seen, I honestly forget, I'm pretty sure I mentioned this, is tied to the work of Garrett Tyson. And so I think he does a really wonderful job about talking about the semiotics of texts. And I was just using some of his same framework and talking about the semiotics of looking at context. There's also other stuff that you could look at this way, just by way of reference. There's a great book by, is it Hodge and Kress, on social semiotics that I found very, very helpful many years ago. I've done a lot of reading in this field and a lot of work in social semiotics. And actually, it too, although it's talking about semiotics in society and culture, it has a lot of implications back we're looking at texts. So you're right, it's a very continuous stream. And I can see a post-colonialist take on this would really work nicely. So
Wonderful. Well, I think I need to wrap it up now, but I think you'll understand now why I was raising that practical theological question. An issue we're dealing with constantly here is the relationship of the use of various social science methodologies to the normative theological tasks and ways in which that impacts, in particular, how we understand preaching. So I really feel good about having had you here today and join with us in that conversation. I'd almost love to have a whole nother webinar with you just talking about all that you've written in practical theology, because that is really lurking so close to the surface in a lot of the kinds of questions we're asking, to my mind. But
I mean, the issue that you named, David, I mean, those are the questions of my life.
Yeah.
Ask your colleague Nancy Ammerman,
right.
Who was on my doctoral committee. These questions about theological claim and social reality. I mean, it's what I've been doing ever since I was in the parish.
Well,
yeah.
we'll use that as an inspiration, perhaps, for a future invitation. But for now, I want to, first of all, acknowledge the presence of another doctoral student, Johan Go, who is in the chat room, just to acknowledge that he participated as well today. He's an excellent doctoral student looking at an indigenous Korean theology of preaching. And so I'm hoping maybe in the future we'll bring him in on the conversation as well. But in the meantime, let me thank you for coming and being with us today, even with all the technical difficulties. It's been good to talk with you, Dr. Nieman, and to go more deeply into your research.
Good. Thank you. Thanks very much for having me as a part of your classroom and for the opportunity. It was really a lot of fun.
All right.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.